complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about a blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right. Sean Weiland, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Oh, pleasure to be here as always. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you back on. So my show has grown quite a bit in the time since I've spoken to you last. So I don't want to give the full bio just in the interest of time. But for some of my new viewers who may not be familiar with who you are, could you describe, what you do just quickly?
Yeah, quick background is I own a wealth management firm, primarily with business exit planning. So helping people who are selling a business to get the most for their business and to avoid significant tax consequences from that sale. But that dovetails into a lot of, finance, economic theory, which gets into politics and so on. And that's kind of why I'm here.
Definitely. And our last episode was quite good. I'll put it this way. There are very few appearances by people who have appeared on no other podcasts that are as well received as that was. There were a lot of people very interested in what you had to say. So I'm happy to have you back on. So we
flattery will get you everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, really. Yeah, that's how you win at this game. But yep. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is that we planned this almost immediately after the last one. I was like, all right, you got to come back on in about 6 weeks. And when we did that, we actually didn't have a particular topic we wanted to cover when we planned it. And so over the kind of intervening weeks, you and I were talking back and forth. And you mentioned that there was something you wanted to address. So do you want to introduce that topic briefly?
Yeah, sure. So the perennial conversation that I have with most of our friends is the need for the feeling of career advancement and life advancement to be able to afford normal household formation of a job where you're increasing wealth beyond covering basic expenses. You can afford home ownership. You can afford to go on dates and go on vacations and eventually have household formation and get married and have children. I mean, these are all ambitions that I think many of us are striving for that used to just be kind of a given even several decades ago. And trying to alleviate that bottleneck of, okay, well, this is a problem. How do we solve it for our friends? And since I have this, business development background, that was really my first focus. And I think that then dovetails with a problem that even I have in running my own business and working with other business owners is the nature of the managerial revolution and kind of people who are doing well in that other economy. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland or through the looking glass. They're not worried about resources. They're worried about attention, right? They want to be seen. That's how they get advancement. And so there's kind of this tension between like we're playing different games, that we're playing checkers and they're playing chess, or we're just playing by different rules. And before we started, you'd mentioned, was it Black Horse had touched on, the system is working great for them. It doesn't work at all for our objectives.
Well, certainly. And there's several things there that we can get into, but I think it's important to make that distinction between wealth and status, right? That you're kind of getting at there. That there are certainly people who are kind of wealthy beyond our wildest dreams who almost care absolutely nothing about money, right? And I'm sure you've met these people having worked with, the wealthy, right? Mm-hmm. And, kind of conversely, there are also people who are very high status, a lot of activists, a lot of academics, a lot of artists who are very high status, who get invited to the same parties as these, wealthy people, but make very, very little money. Mm-hmm. And so when we're kind of looking at, what do we have as the American right, which I realize is a very diverse group of people that doesn't really, describe any one group. To be honest, they tend to be middle class of one stripe or another. Obviously there are exceptions to that, but it is a party of the middle, right? If you look at MAGA, on the low end, you have, kind of like working, what you would either call not quite the working poor, but kind of like working class to middle class people, right? Which is, even though, traditionally working class was the bottom class, there is one below that, that is a client of the Democrat Party. And then on the other end, you have like the MyPillow guy, who, don't get me wrong, is probably a wealthy guy, but he's not Bill Gates wealthy, mm-hmm. And so I think that, it's interesting you bring that up there. So
I really like the way you put that as middle class. I mean, it just makes me think of Sam Francis's Revolution from the Middle. I mean, I think he was trying to address exactly that same issue.
Well, right. And it's the classic de juvenile high, low versus middle thing, that we are essentially a coalition of the middle, and the question is, how do we either, find a new elite, and become their patrons, or kind of jostle that current elite out of power. So one of the things that you talk about is basically like how to get our guys kind of up Maslow's hierarchy, up to the point where they are, at the point where they have disposable income, they have a little bit of sway, right? And I think it's important for a couple reasons, which is one, wealth and power are not synonymous, but there's a strong correlation, right? As part of it. And then also just from the perspective of like having conversations like these are to a certain extent a luxury good. If you are just kind of working as I've done before, like working like a 60-hour job, it's very difficult to actually think. And I think that, when you have a group of people who have a lot of mental horsepower, they're kind of wasted,
This is exactly kind of my inspiration too, is that we do a lot of talking and not a lot of action. And, it'd be a lot easier if we would just actually fix these problems instead of talking about it, especially kind of more of these maybe high-minded ideals of, a new Caesar or, well, when we're in charge, things will be different. It's like, okay, can we just be able to, not to be all Jordan Peterson, but maybe we should make our bed and, afford buying a starter home before we try conquering the world.
No, certainly. And I think that, part of that, and I think that this is because I have my own like limited data on my audience. And while my audience is older than me, it's not by much, and I get the sense that the average guy in these circles, the average listener, just going off of, what I see and what others have, is basically a guy in his late 20s to early 30s, and obviously there are tales on both ends. But to me, I do think that, I mean, to be honest, it's a lot of guys who aren't necessarily exactly where they want to be, and so I do think that there is a certain amount of resentment from that. Now, part of that on the front end, especially with younger guys, is that it is, if you don't meet certain criteria, you're barred from certain traditional avenues of advancement.
The ladder's been pulled up from them. Right.
And that's obviously not 100% the case. There are certainly successful young men, but it is that feeling of kind of like, wait a minute, why can't I do this anymore? So there's something. So what are your kind of suggestions for someone in that situation? Like, what's a good way to go forward? Or are you talking more necessarily about like that needs to be a priority, I guess?
So that's a great, because I'm older, in my early 40s, and the nature of the work I do, I mean, that's a good question. I want to come back to that, but contextually, I tend to think of it more from the patrician point of view of how do we, how do we get an investor pool of people who could have, maybe $50 million to invest in private equity, where we know that the businesses we're investing in share our values and are our guys, and that they're going to be managed accordingly with that. Part of that too, so a point I did want to get into without getting in the deep end here is, I observe there's a difference between, there's kind of like a tendency to try to cash in on a scene. And, all due respect to Oron and the guys at Blaze, Matt, what's his name? I'm spacing on his name right now, but they're selling to an audience, right? So all of the advertisements that they run, and hey, you got to run ads because you got to, generate revenue and make profit in order to succeed. But they're kind of doing it in an entertainment point of view, and then they're selling to an audience, which is a very traditional business model. But I think it's incomplete because it's not looking at the holistic cycle of, okay, is the audience that you're catering to, who are the ones that you care about and feel camaraderie with, are they better off because they're buying these things that you're selling them? Sometimes, crowd health, maybe. Sugar-free cereal, I'm not so sure. Not to get any sponsors knocked out like Norm Macdonald and the Man Great, but the converse of that I think we need to examine more is like the Chick-fil-A model, where they're selling, God sandwich to everybody, even maybe people who hate them, as a company or their ethical guidelines, but they like that sandwich so much that they buy it anyway. And then they're making money hand over fist, but they are extremely selective about who they employ, and even more extremely selective about who they allow to buy into that franchise. And they also make sure that it's not purely economic driven. They'll make sure there's enough diversification of ownership within a geographic reason, so that it's not just like one super wealthy person who owns like a whole state or something like that. That kind of more dynamic thought of how to grow, like a healthy economy. Very similar to like Mark Spitznagel's idea in Tao of Capital of kind of fast growth that isn't durable versus slow growth that tends to be stronger. So like, a slow growing oak tree versus a fast growing pine tree. Having that, something where the ecology is going to be more resilient and not just fast, but becomes tinder. Basically, this is kind of where my thought is how do we actually get something sustainable? And then a big part of that too is that you're building loyalty and you're building culture. You're giving people roots, you're giving people ties, which is something we talk a lot about. And yet, at the end of talking about it, we all go home and feel terribly atomized and like we're losing that. So for all our talk of creating culture, well, we need to do it. And in order to do it, it needs to be economically viable. So, all these things I think are tied together. And that's, let's actually solve that problem is basically where I'm headed.
Well, and I think that that's something that you see other parallel societies engage in, right? That like you have
right.
The Amish, and don't get me wrong. I think the Amish the regime is eventually going to come for the Amish. It's just kind of a question of when. They're kind of a low priority. But, you have what's largely a parallel society, but they do index with wider culture for economic reasons, right? That you can buy furniture from the Amish, you can buy baked goods. There are certain businesses that kind of cater to that. And, even kind of less strict, but still kind of parallel societies like Mennonites do it at kind of a level that's perhaps more achievable for someone who's not willing to go full on Luddite. It's this idea that there is very much still an us and them, but it is the in-group does kind of go outside of their social network. And one of the things that I think is important, and I realize that this whole thing is still at a nascent stage, but one of the positive signs I'm seeing is the kind of development of social and relational capital, right? People meeting together, developing kind of a system of basically, hey, someone needs something, let's work together. Like, hey, do you know a guy who does this? Do you know a guy who does that? Now, some of that's completely informal, and the informal network is probably faster than a formalized one, but it's also limited by, kind of like word of mouth. And then you have what the guys at, New Founding, or what the guys at, it's New Founding, and then the other one by Bennett's Phylactery, I cannot remember, Exit Group, are doing, which is kind of a formalized version of that I think is interesting. So do you have any kind of, specific ideas like, oh, this would be a good way to facilitate that? Or is this just kind of a strategy more broadly?
Well, so for the issue I see is kind of one of scale. We don't have the heavy hitters of who can come in with, 50 million, 100 million, which when I look at the traditional finance space is almost kind of a drop in the bucket. I mean, it sounds odd, but that's like a small sized hedge fund or small sized private equity fund. But we can't. So trying to close that gap of, okay, well, who is going to be our sponsor? Who's going to be our patron? Who is actually going to put their neck on the line for us because they believe in it? And kind of like Elon Musk has, right? Like there's going to be an endless debate that Elon is not our guy. But at least he's putting his money where his mouth is, and he's building rockets and wants to go to Mars. He has a vision, and taking control of Twitter because he has his own idea of what free speech means. And he's going to stick to it. That kind of, walking the walk and not just talking the talk, that's the part that I'm trying to close. Now, the difficulty is, the reason I can't just go to one of these private equity funds that I would, sell any given business for is because, the the managerial economy, which is mainstream now, it's playing by its own rules, and it's putting a square peg into a round hole to talk about, well, we need I don't know, manufacturing businesses or something that, something that feels like it's so okay. So I guess a better way of putting this is it's very much like Richard Werner's problem of that asset bubbles crowd out capex. Why should I invest in businesses that seem very grounded, like a machine shop or a chain of muffler shops or something where, okay, you're doing something that obviously has physical value and can afford to pay people well and generates that slow growth, when kind of going back to that Mark Spitznagel model, when the fast growth of, well, let's just pump up an asset bubble, cash out to somebody else and, laugh all the way to the bank before they realize they have a pig in a poke. Doing that based on the attention economy, whether it was the dot-com bubble or the Web 2.0 advertising, which is basically what's ruled ever since advertising and marketing world. AI is kind of in that bubble now, but or even the market share at all cost, right? Uber and Airbnb and the reason why tech stocks are through the roof and they never make a profit is their metrics are all about, well, we want to be the monopoly someday. We want to be the app for whatever X is. And that's a very managerialist mindset of like, well, I just want to have the monopoly. And Peter Thiel has a point in 0 to 1 with that as well. But what they're not talking about is, okay, well, is this profitable? Does this have sustainable growth? Is this doing something that's actually useful to the people who are buying it? Or is it more like investing in a casino or some other kind of entertainment where yeah, it's making money and it makes a profit relative to its expenses, but there's no there, that people are not better off. There's not more resources in the world because of a casino or OnlyFans or, these other things. And it's because, that side of it is in their world, scarcity isn't real, and they'll get academia to try to confirm this myth of being in a post-scarcity society, or even, getting into a history lesson, going back to, the progressive era, the late 19th, early 20th century. There is a lot of writing on the problem of overproduction. Well, what if we make things too cheap and too plentiful? Then what will we do? Like, as if that was the concern. And it's just a difference in mindset that, basically, how are we going to funnel from one to the other? I think if we can find the right sponsor, that would be great. I think there's the possibility of doing something like that with crypto, especially as there's a rollover from traditional finance to crypto, which I think is kind of inevitable anyway, because traditional finance of traditional securities is in this demographic crisis, as well as, unsustainable bubble. There's even some interesting lessons to be learned from like how Amway scaled, even though, Amway is generally considered to be kind of like a scam or a pyramid scheme. But the way that they were able to gather savings from a community of people who believed in the process. Like, so Amway, and there's some very good books on this that I can reference in my notes, but the original idea with that was basically direct marketing, which is what influencer marketing is now. And the idea was, well, you're not going to shop from, the big stores. You're going to shop from your friends. And then your friends are going to get wealthy because they're the ones who, know about those goods and services. And they're in the best position to guide you on what to get. Okay, so far, so good. That actually sounds pretty amenable. And then the way they bootstrap that, because again, they did not have access to typical managerial capital from banking and private equity, is, well, they got buy-in from the other members. And this is the part where it became kind of shady. But the idea is, okay, well, everybody's going to be an entrepreneur. You're going to put down $50,000 or $20,000 or whatever it is to buy into this business. And that's what got the system bootstrapped. And for all its faults, Amway was a big part. I mean, even Betsy DeVos now is a name, but it was a big part of like the Reagan Revolution and getting, kind of a right-wing turn in politics. It really was enough of a parallel counterforce that's a big part of kind of the critique of, of it as MLM or whatever too, is, again, certainly there is corruption and greed and problems, but a lot of that is also a heavy critique of the model, just because, you know, the wrong people were getting rich, which is the same criticism of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, right? Oh, you know, you're bypassing the gatekeepers, and that's no good. So we've got to make it illegal or make it seem sorted, or otherwise, you know, put a stink on it that good people aren't going to want to be associated with it.
Yeah, it is interesting, that idea of the wrong people got rich. You know, that there is a certain part of it, and I don't know how much of this is true. This is wild, baseless speculation, right? But when I look at someone like Elizabeth Warren, who's on this kind of like anti-crypto tirade, you know, who's like very much going into that sphere. And, you know, when you look at her history, right, at Harvard, you can't do that and be this sort of like anti-establishment, you know, like freedom fighter she will sometimes paint herself as. You know, and that's one of those ones where I'm like, I have no idea who is paying you, but I'm quite convinced someone is.
Well, at the same time, Nancy Pelosi is the greatest hedge fund manager, or, you know, greatest, you know, trader ever to exist. You know, these are coming from the same place, right? Because politics is about rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. So play ball and you get rewarded with, you know, inside info or opportunities that aren't available to everybody else. And, you know, the punishing the enemies is, you know, and again, there's legitimate criticisms of them, but, you know, Trump businesses, or, you know, DeVos's and Amway, or, you know, other models that were rivalrous with the regime, they get slapped down hard.
Definitely. Yeah, it's one of those things you talk about, the kind of like crisis of, you know, traditional investing. And one of the things I always wonder is, because the kind of modern portfolio theory, you know, this idea that you are just betting on just the increase in everything. Like, to me, that idea is very much dependent on America being the, you know, the empire of the world, and effectively controlling, you know, much of the world's money supply, right? And the moment that America has to sort of operate by normal rules again, you know, in the same way that a country like, you know, Germany or the Nordics do, where they have this kind of intense control over, you know, debt and money production, right? Because they're normal countries. To me, I always wonder, like, well, okay, like, well, what happens when, you know, we lose that ability? The whole of kind of, I don't know what you'd call this, but I guess like a modern monetary theorists would say, like, the ability to control inflation by kind of like tying up money into these like long-term assets, right? Like, where does that go? You know, and obviously we're at the end of not at the end. Actually, I guess maybe we are, depending on your view.
You could argue, yeah, like commodity super cycle or something like
that.
Yes,
yeah. But in addition, there's kind of like, well, where do you go when you don't make anything? You know, because you mentioned earlier, you know, because of the kind of the nature of managerialism, it leads to that focus on like that greater return you get from essentially just betting on the increase in the size of everything. And sorry, I'm using very general terms for a reason. Yeah.
Right. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, right? You know, the Great Stagnation now, I think, is very much a parallel to the Brezhnev stagnation in the Soviet Union in the 70s. There was a point where the Soviet Union, you know, Khrushchev tried doing his reforms and they kind of blew up in his face. Corn didn't work, and the new fields that they opened up worked for like a season or two, and then all of the nutrients were gone and it ended catastrophically. So when Brezhnev came in, and if you talk to people who grew up in the Soviet Union, they'll talk about how the Brezhnev years were kind of like the romanticized years of like, well, at least things were stable, things were okay. You know, that's what they remember fondly. And it was just this era of stagnation of, well, we can't reform. Our food production is permanently hosed because of collective farming, and nobody who knows how to farm is alive anymore. And that's never going to improve. And so they just kind of settled into like a you know, a shrug your shoulders, clear pill, you know, okay, I guess this is it, you know, like just kind of a nihilism about their circumstances. And I think that very much is the position we're in now. That's why we see both in America and China, the lying flat or let it rot phenomenon. Part of where, you know, I was talking with our friends in various groups earlier that you know, my whole life, I feel like, well, if I don't succeed, I'm always at the risk of being homeless or starving. Like my life depends on me. And consistently people kind of laugh at that. It's like, oh, you don't know how to be poor. I think is kind of, you don't know how to game the system is the feedback I get. It's like, yeah, if you're committed to being poor, you know how to game the system to survive. You will never genuinely be in a position of being homeless or starving once you give into to knowing how that game is played. And so again, that comes back to the coalition of the bottom and the top, right? The people who are rich, well, they don't worry about it at all because they've got the money. And the people at the bottom have this safety net that they know they can always depend on. So for them, yeah, scarcity isn't real, which is why they can live in this shadow realm of, either I'm going to be the CEO of a company or I'm going to be a rapper, right? It's like either way, it's all about fame and status more than it is about, I hope I generate enough food this year to get through the winter, which I think is very much for us in the middle. We're thinking about those practical things. So you mentioned kind of other countries that don't have the exorbitant privilege. And it also made me think about America's really the only country in the world where owning a business or equity or shares of stock has any kind of perceived value. In most other countries, because on the one hand, because there's a socialist bent where the government owns, maybe 20% of the company, or a trade union owns 20% of the company. Nobody feels like that stock is real. They kind of know it's a rigged game, whereas here it's so well disguised that people can still, neoliberals or boomer cons can kind of trick themselves of like, no, it's really a capitalist country, I swear. Everywhere else, the illusion is much more obvious. But as a result, and because of that money creation pouring into an asset bubble, America is a place where trying to grow a business and build up a stock price and eventually sell out is a dominant activity. In any other countries that don't have that exorbitant privilege, the way you're making wealth is either from land or so like real estate or renting or owning it for farming, and then commodities of farming, mining, natural resource production. And that's kind of basically it. Like either you're digging stuff out of the ground, you're growing it in the ground, and you're selling it for, to the worldwide market. Or you're the landlord that has to get paid because people have to live on your land. Like that's it as far as the options available. So maybe that clarifies what needs to be done or the position to be in to survive that kind of transition. I know Weimar Germany was very much like that. Like everybody always thinks of how the Great Depression, everybody was starving, but it was really the middle class who owned stocks who took it on the chin. And then the people who actually had physical control of the farms and the factories actually did better as a result of that because the demand was there. Suddenly they had the thing that everybody really needed. So that kind of, direct control and possession is 9/10 of the law. Hopefully that helps crystallize maybe the approach of, how to position ourselves for this transition.
It's an interesting point you made there. And I think that, recently there's been a lot in the news of very wealthy and powerful people putting their capital in physical resources, right? Buying up land. And going back to kind of bringing 2 points together, you mentioned that, the wrong people getting rich off of it. I believe that a New Founding had announced a plan to basically put together sort of a gated community in Tennessee. And, they had secured the funding for it. They were kind of putting out like a white paper, basically, like very kind of early in the process. And you would not believe the media storm this kicked up, this kind of like relatively small group of people doing something that is completely and totally legal. But of course, it's got articles comparing it to, the Branch Davidians, all of this, and this is after 4 or 5 years where, the world's wealthiest men have bought, millions of acres of American art land, largely, unremarked upon. It's
or
just interesting.
Chinese ownership under various anonymous trusts, right?
Right, exactly. And it's very clear that, and I don't say this to bring up like, oh, the regime isn't fair, because, well, of course it's not. But it is interesting to see such a stark example where it's like 3 guys get together to have a private community. I realize I'm minimizing it, but it is funny to see it. And
But
so
it means you're over the target, right? Isn't that when you see
yes.
an outsized response, it means, oh yeah, dig here. This is clearly, yeah, the direction to go in.
And this is being recording shortly after my episode with Dutton went up, and he kind of brought up this similar idea of, as these empires fracture, they really tend to fracture. Like it's not these big cohesive blocks. It's just this kind of like splintering. And what he says is that effectively the way to get through a situation like that is you sort of have to kind of adopt older modes of living. You have to have a network. You have to have a group of people around you. And I think that it's sort of a weird mode of thought to combine opinions like we have about capital, which is traditionally very much associated with this kind of like atomized individualism, right? With this realization that effectively you're going to have to squat up to get through this, speaking very broadly, of course.
Yep.
And so if you are, talking to someone, say like me, right, early 20s, who has quite a while to go before acquiring, real estate is really an option. What's the move? Is the move to just like, get the largest amount of money you can as quick as possible and essentially try to buy in quickly? What's your suggestion there? And I realize, of course, giving financial advice is always a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not giving. None of this is financial advice.
You should not listen to anything I've said. This is very clear. I'm an anonymous person on the internet.
And there's an element of this that people are at different stages in their life, and that the future is not like the past. So to try to speak to a contemporary 20-year-old, something that I would think someone of that generation would be aware of or good at that would help, and something that I'm not so good at despite trying, is this whole influencer culture, caring about celebrity thing is very alien to me. As a man, that was, it's like what women's magazines in the grocery store were for in the 80s and 90s. It's not something, but now because of the Longhouse, it's everybody cares about being an influencer, because then that's, supposedly what's attractive to women, or, which then leads to opportunities. And, I get it. But the other side of that is, like you said, of squatting up, that are you good at organizing? So I guess the training of organizing people to be a leader and to really try to put those networks together, and to successfully do that in a way where you can turn a profit, or that you feel like it's worth your time. That's, especially because a lot of that is sweat equity. So you don't necessarily need the money up front, other than just the gumption to actually go out and talk to people and organize. If I had to spitball an idea, that's probably where I would start is, for a young guy who's fit, I think it keeps coming back to that martial arts is really vital, both for physical health, for self-discipline. And it's something that you find like-minded people. I did Aikido for years, and Aikido kind of in the West has this reputation of like the martial art of peace or something, because it's a soft art instead of a hard art. But the people in the Japanese Empire who were holding their meetings in Aikido dojos, and the history of how Aikido first developed, is way more right-wing than they ever really want to publicly admit. And there's been some martial arts historians who've dug this up and found some very intriguing history behind it that's kind of been whitewashed since then. But there's something to that. I think if you can, you're demonstrating a skill, and you're working with people that you're building up that trust. So let's say by the time you're like a middle rank in a martial art at a local dojo where people, maybe you're taking on some of the responsibilities of, you're trusted with the keys to open in the morning and close at night, or to be able to clean or whatever, and they know you're not going to rob the place. I think those small steps and building out from there. I know actually Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is really big on this. People really use that for business networking. It's a way where you're separating the wheat from the chaff, that the people who actually commit to it and take it seriously and demonstrate their improvement, that trust transfers. Okay, I see the trust of your interest and commitment to this. I'm also then going to trust you, with a business opportunity, or I don't know, even like loaning money or something like that. Sort of like the war buddy bond, right? Hey, I trust you with my life in the war. After the war is over, let's be business partners in a car dealership or whatever it is. And because you've built that trust when it really was a matter of life and death, it carries over into kind of more the commercial realm. Yeah, that's my best guess. It's really hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone in their 20s, especially the psychology is different too. There just seems to be a lot more that the atomization has gotten really bad. It seems like there's a lot more anxiety, a lot more fear of interacting, like approach anxiety, and just like shyness times a million seems to be an issue. But yeah, I'm going to stick with it. Join a martial arts studio, overcome being shy, build a network from there. And then I imagine there's older successful men who are also doing that, maybe they've got a business idea, or maybe you can be the networker that turns that into more than just, working out and training 3 nights a week.
Well, and that's the social capital thing that I'm talking about, because, when we look, and I think that it's important that, American right wingers sort of view themselves as a minority group, because that's effectively what they are.
Yep.
And, as much as I've derided Rod Dreher, he's actually kind of right about this, that you sort of need to adopt the modes of, a cultural minority in order to survive as a cultural minority. When you look at especially those kind of middlemen minorities, like the Chinese, they're in their diaspora, perhaps another diaspora. A lot of that is predicated along, these type of social ties that we're talking about. It's not like, when, diamond traders, for instance, in certain ethnic groups, they don't accomplish those trades by using a kind of formalized service. It's this network of social contacts where it's like, okay, well, even if I don't know you, you're my best friend's cousin or something like that. So there's kind of a social layer to it. And so, there's a lot of poo-pooing that goes along with certain social events put on by us and our friends. But those actually have a very valuable, component to it. And I can speak to it as someone who's only been to one and quite enjoyed myself. Because what you're doing is you're taking something that is kind of to be a little bit blunt from a certain perspective, it can almost become a fandom, right? No different from guys who like metal, or guys who are really, really into like, I don't know, like transistor radios or something. And you're taking that and turning it into a social thing where it's like, okay, oh, I know that guy. He just had a kid. I know that his mom's sick, so we'll help him out. And obviously networking as a term has a very negative connotation to it, because oftentimes it's like local chamber of commerce events where 55 realtors or 55 people who are trying to be realtors will tell you to, buy a house from them or something like that. And then you eat like bad hors d'oeuvres.
There is that, but I will say, speaking to the young people, to the youths, I encounter all the time too, where they are terrified because they grew up in cancel culture. They're just terrified to stake their reputation on anything. I make it very clear. I don't think networking is a dirty word. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that just is kind of par for the course, or, part of human interaction is like, hey, it's not always going to be perfect. But it stops a lot of young people, the fear to try, right? What did Machiavelli say of, have the strength to do bold things, not the strength to suffer, like have the courage to risk making mistakes. And, whether it's because of helicopter parenting or again, cancel culture, there's a lot of fear of, oh, I'd like to introduce these people, or I could recommend, the service people I use for this or that. But if they have a bad experience, it reflects on me, and I don't want them, I'm terrified of they're going to write a bad review about me on Yelp or something like that. And it's like, man, Yelp reviews are, but like, let them write a bad review. It's somebody angry on the internet. Like there's that for everybody. What are you worried about? So this like fear of reputational harm. This is also, again, like this longhouse phenomenon of that, like reputational harm is the soft power weapon that gets used. That's how women nitpick each other until one of them develops an eating disorder. This is not what, fit, military aged, go-getter hustler men should really be worried about.
So I have two comments about that. The first one is whoever she is, she could probably lose some weight. And the second one is, this is actually something that I think we need to internalize as the right wing, right? Which is that if you have set yourself in opposition to the regime, you cannot and should not expect their accolades, right? And
right.
Much of their control is that kind of soft power through reputation. I wrote a Substack on that called Real Dissident Roll Call. And essentially it makes that same point, right? That if you've set yourself out as a dissident, you know, you're going to have to accept the fact that the things you do are not high status from a certain perspective, right? And so one of the things that I think is interesting in all of this, right, is that, you know, if you were creating a parallel culture and a parallel, you know, kind of like network, right, your reputation matters quite a bit, but it matters within that network, not outside.
Well,
you know?
And for men, what we used to understand is that your reputation, it's based on competence more than reputation. I mean, reputation is going to be earned, but it comes from that competence of, you know, well, show me what you've done. Now, you know, being good at the first step towards being good at something, or, you know, sucking at something is the first step towards being kind of good at something. You know, nobody is immediately good at playing guitar. You're going to be bad at it, but if you keep at it, eventually you'll be kind of good, and then you can start playing gigs. And then if you need to demonstrate it, it's not, oh, he has a good reputation of being good at playing guitar. We just listen to him play, and the proof is in the pudding. You know, this again is Sam Francis's point of, you know, right-wing minded people are results oriented of, you know, either it works or it doesn't. Either you fixed my car and it runs, or you didn't and it doesn't run. Like, you have very obvious markers of like success and failure. The reputation based left-wing, you know, soft power, feminine model, whatever you wanted, that whole orbit is very much about making excuses and spin control. And, you know, oh, we meant that to work that way all along. You know, didn't we tell you that this, you know, this crappy outcome is actually everything working exactly the way we intended? You know, they're always retrofitting current circumstance, you know, the current situation to match, as opposed to being like, oh yeah, we screwed up, we'll fix it, here's our plan to fix it, right? Like, then that makes them look bad or incompetent, which they're terrified of, so they've got to find some kind of spin control. But on the right, we have to get comfortable with failure. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was a important thing to bring up. So we've spoken about the need of attracting an elite, attracting capital. I know you mentioned the Chick-fil-A model, but I think one of the dangers is that on one hand, you know, you have to be, you know, radical and interesting enough to have something to say, but also you don't want to become so much of a pariah that you become impossible to invest in, right?
Right.
And so how do you think that our guys, you know, who have skills, who have, you know, marketable ability, how do they attract capital from the outside?
Yeah, that's the question. So part of it, I think, is, you know, if it's something that's necessary, that goes a long way. I'm a huge fan of the TV show House. Obviously it's a TV show. But, you know, that was kind of the conceit of his character, is that he's, you know, irascible and says off-color things and basically offensive to everyone, but he can't be fired, and everybody, you know, needs him in the end, because he's going to save your life, and he's the only person who can. Like, he's got the world over a barrel because he's so good at that outcome. And that outcome, as much as, you know, people want to throw standards out the window or say outcomes don't matter, when it's a question of your life and death, that tends to be the one that everybody really sticks with, you know, and especially on the left, where they think death is, you know, truly the end of it. You know, say they value their life more than anything. So positions where that kind of leverage exists, I think, is, you know, the ability to be a shrewd negotiator and understand how to use that as a form of power, I think is really the key. And okay, so maybe this is a silly example, but it's one I run into a lot, is in the world of dating. there's a lot of complaints of women being entitled or spoiled. And again, it's because you have a lot of guys who are just kind of the simps who are giving it all away, asking for nothing in return. And when the world constantly hands you everything on the silver platter, then it's very easy to be bored or to seek danger because you're surrounded by the nice guys, or a lot of these, maladaptions to that phenomenon. But women are net resource consumers and men are net resource producers. And in a heartbeat, if you just had the political will or the shift in culture to say, well, no, I'm not going to give it away to people who don't earn it. Same way that, the closer legs, I guess, would be the female equivalent. They'd find out real quick, oh yeah, I can't make it in this world unless I, meet the standards of the people who can produce those goods. It sounds like I'm just saying going galt. But I think there's something to that, is to be in a position of power that you have what people need and we're taking it for granted. That kind of long-term investment thinking, I think it is the way to get through this. And then once people need you, it's also came up in the dating world because from female friends of mine in that space, they'll talk about, well, we were at this point where women don't need men, but they want men. And don't you want to be wanted and not needed? Isn't it genuine desire when you're wanted instead of needed? I've been thinking about that. I don't know that that's the case. And I don't know that's actually what turns women on either. I know we're kind of going afield here, but, Machiavelli had it with, it's would you rather be feared or loved? And it's best to be both. And it's great, but love is fickle, which is the problem that people are running into. You do one thing slightly wrong, or, your car's the wrong color, or, the man wears a raincoat and that's an ick for certain women. And then the whole thing is blown up. And that's because, love is fickle, but fear gets compliance. Fear, wins loyalty at the end of the day. And if it is fear of, I won't be able to get food, or I won't have a place to live, or I won't be able to survive without adhering. It's like the discipline of a father, right? Your father loves you, but you're also kind of afraid of your father as a child. And I think that duality, your father can't be your best friend, or you're going to have problems as an adult. I think that dynamic, is what we need to cultivate.
Well, and I think that, what we see is that, at least so far, the regime is willing to sacrifice efficiency and output for kind of immediate political gain. And while I don't necessarily see a sign of that stopping in the immediate future, eventually someone realizes that, hey, like, we need bridges to work, things like that. And whether that's a counter elite who basically says, like, okay, you can't run a society like this, you're terrible at it, like my turn to grab the wheel. I think that that's an important way to look at it, is like cultivate value either in the kind of like physical sense of owning, something that will be valuable regardless of economic circumstance, or have a skill that people need no matter what, is sort of the same thing. You're making yourself invaluable. And this is really the Peter Thiel model, that it seems like the people in charge of this country really, really hate Peter Thiel, but they need him. And so maybe that's a good enough note to end it. So Sean, we're out of time. If people want to find, you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
I should really, so Sean does it on Telegram and Instagram. That's me. I guess that's the best way to get a hold of me. I should probably have more of like a landing page or something.
You can also check out our previous episode if you want to hear more of your thoughts in long form. Like I said, I'll have both of those linked if people want to contact you directly. And again, Sean, I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Definitely. And if you want to support my show, you can do that by watching it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you consume podcasts. I also have a Substack. I think it's quite good. At the very least, it is getting better. And if you want to support the show directly, the best way to do that is by supporting our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Part of the things that Sean mentioned is not being fat. And there are few ways to not be fat better than to head over to Axios. And again, Sean, I appreciate your time.
Yep. Thank you.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.